Adele became an anti-apartheid activist as a result of her opposition to the injustices of the apartheid system, the growing militarization.
Can I leave this on this screen and put my other thing on that screen?
Put it back. Put it back. Can't you just mute everybody?
Yeah, can you mute everyone? Thank you. We may never get through your bio. And she's headed up several anti-apartheid organizations. She was a founding member of Gun Free South Africa and became its director in March 1995. She was responsible for building the organization into a national NGO, which together with the Gun Control Alliance has played an important role in advocating for stricter gun laws in South Africa. She returned to Gun Free as its director in 2014-15 and is the author of the book A Nation Without Guns, the story of Gun Free South Africa. Adele, shall I hand over to you, and then I'll introduce you, Eldred, just before your intervention.
Okay, great. Thanks to UCT Criminology Department for hosting this event. I think it's a really important conversation for us to be having. So I've worked on the issue of small arms control really for almost 30 years, since 95, when I helped start Gun Free South Africa. And what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to draw on that experience and use it to inform my understanding of the current bill, the Firearms Control Amendment Bill. And the way I'm going to do it is there are going to be really three kind of parts to my input. The first is that I'm going to look at the context in which this bill has arisen, but also the principal act, which we now know as the Firearms Control Act. But in 1999-2000, it was known as the Firearms Bill. So I'm going to look at these two bills, the Principal Act in 1999-2000 and the current bill. And I'm going to look at the context in which these two bills have arisen. Then I'm going to look at what we in the small arms control movement talk about as the key elements of good gun laws. And this is called the Zimring principles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and the impact that good gun laws can have on levels of gun violence. And then my third kind of section of my input is just to offer some observations on how the current bill is being drafted. And some concerns about that process. So to go to the first part is to look at the context in which these two bills, 20 years apart, how they arose. So I'm going to look at the political context. I'm going to look at the use of data. I'm going to look at policy and the meaning of policy and how the policy has developed. And then I'm also going to look at some kind of global context and developments. So to go to the political context of 98, 2000, we were a new democratic order. There's something like 800 to 900 new laws that were passed in the first 10 years of our democracy. It was a government of national unity, and this is really important in terms of how that shaped the kind of clauses that came into the Firearms Control Act. But there were also huge, high levels of trust in terms of the new government, high levels of optimism, kind of that somehow we were going to do this. And and the Firearms Bill was a very definitive break from our apartheid past, where gun legislation privileged white people and in fact encouraged whites to get guns, made it easy for people to get guns. The Firearms Act was a very definitive break from that. What do we have now in 2022 while we're trying to craft an amendment to the Principal Act? We have a ruling party that's fractured, incoherent, without a clear program. We're 27 years into our democracy, and we have high levels of mistrust right across the state, and particularly with regard to the police. So it's a very different context in which we're trying to make significant amendments to the gun law. What is shared across those 20 years is high levels of violent crime. In fact, if you look at 98. 98 is the apex of all our, even though things look fairly bad today, they're not as bad as they were in 98. Okay, because in 98, you had 34 people being shot and killed every day. And in fact, that's going to take me into the data. That was almost the only bit of data we had in 98, 99. 34 people shot and killed every single day. But data was really important in helping craft and shape the Firearms Bill of 2000. One of the reasons the data was important was the first time that we were collecting information across the various provinces, the homelands, the TBV states. So we have this book done by Rob Chetty, who was a police officer and is still a serving police officer in KZN, firearm use and distribution in South Africa. And it's a really important resource because it's essentially our baseline data about who owns the guns, what kind of guns are being owned, who's been killed with the guns. Okay. And now, I mean, in 2022, we have masses of information. We have much more information to help inform an amendment bill than we did in 99, 2000. What are the kind of, I guess, so in preparing this, I mean, it was really interesting for me. I kind of compared the data points in 98 to the data points now. And you see some, I guess, the same data points remain important. Your murder rate, okay, the number of the murder rate, the gun homicide murder rate in relation to your overall homicide rates. And in 98, that was 49% of all murders a gun was used. Now, and this is one of the challenges, it's 2017 data. It's about a third. Okay, so you can see the shifts happening there because we have an overall reduction in homicide, although quarterly stats on Friday showed a 22% increase in homicide. So I guess I'm trying to, it's a complex picture when you're dealing with data. The important thing, I guess, is, so the differences is that in 98, we had a single point here where in 98, you could look at 170 cops were murdered with firearms, mainly handguns. Most firearms registered at the Central Firearms Register in 98 were handguns, 2.8 million. Okay, handguns, this is in the hands of civilians, that's pistols and revolvers. Handguns are also the firearm of choice for criminals. What do we have now? Those similar data points are there. What's difficult is that they're not available for a single year. So when I look at the data, I've got in 2015, 85% of all robberies were committed with a firearm. We know handguns remain the weapon of choice for criminals. In 2021, in the third quarter, 27 police officers were killed. But what's complex about the current data set is that there are many more sources of data. We've got mortuary data, we've got SAPS data, we've got Stats SA data, but also we're not creating a kind of a comprehensive central picture. So the data points, they're kind of all over the place. And also the state is not sharing the data. So in the quarterly stats released on Friday, the weapon type for murder is not given. That is absolutely critical. If you want to understand what's happening with murder, you need to know the weapon type. We need to know whether guns are increasing or decreasing. Are knives becoming more common? And we've seen that kind of seesaw over the last 10, 15 years. So I guess it's just kind of, what does the current data show us? I think we're clear. I mean, firearms remain the weapon of choice for civilians, for self-defense, and their handguns, they are the weapon of choice for criminals. So you kind of, what is that connection? So I guess those are the common themes over this 20-year period. Cops are being killed, and handguns are the weapon of choice for civilians, for self-defense, and for criminals. So to move on to another point under the context was, how the policy was developed and what it says. So Sidney Mufamadi was Minister of Safety and Security at the time and developed this policy document. And the policy is really very clear. I mean, it's kind of, it's not nuanced, it's very direct. And the key message is to reduce the availability of firearms in the hands of civilians and to address the issue of and the impact of both legal and illegal firearms. So at this point in 1999-2000, government recognizes the kind of intricate relationship between your legal industry and your illicit market for guns. And that in order to control the one, you have to control the other. That's a kind of global norm now, is that if you want to control your illicit stocks, you have to control your legal market. And again, in the intro to the policy, it says the high level of violence, and especially of lethal violence, is driven by the easy availability of firearms. That remains. Okay, so the policy is what was used together with Chetty's baseline data. These are the two key things that inform the Firearms Control Bill in 2000. We have an existing policy. It hasn't changed. And in fact, I want to argue that over the last 20 years, in fact, it has been reaffirmed, reiterated in key government policy documents. The National Development Plan of 2012 makes it very clear. The integrated social crime prevention and integrated social crime prevention strategy talks about it. The white paper on safety and security talks about it. And the most recent report done by the Medical Research Council, specifically on reducing femicide, talks about the need to reduce availability. So this is a key thing. It's about the availability of weapons and it's about the availability of kinds of weapons. It's not a kind of moral issue about whether you don't want white men to be owning guns or young black men in kind of gang areas to be owning guns. It's about what kind of weapon is available and what that weapon does and the impact that weapon has on all of us in this society. Lastly, then, the context. I want to touch on this briefly because it is important, is the global context. So if we cast our mind back to the 90s, national gun control is not on the agenda. It's kind of a small minor thing. You have two big massacres in 96, 6 weeks apart from each other. The Dunblane massacre of 5-year-olds and their teachers, and the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, 35 people shot and killed by an individual gunman with 2 fully automatic rifles. It was the biggest massacre at the time. And of course, we've surpassed that now. But what happens is that there's this rapid movement by both of those respective governments to put in place really strict gun laws. In the UK, handguns are banned for civilian use. In Australia, long guns, rifles, 800,000 rifles are surrendered over an 18-month period. Australia has not had a massacre since then. Why? Because they took the guns out of circulation that make it easy to have massacres. And then even in a bigger context, many of you might remember this, the 1997 ban on landmines. It was a really significant moment because what it says is on the UN agenda, it puts small arms and light weapons as a central issue for UN member states. But what it also does is it demonstrates and it's the emerging role that civil society organizations have in influencing global agreements. And in 2000, you have the Firearms Protocol, which is the only legally binding protocol on small arms and light weapons. We are, of course, our signatory, and in fact, we played a key role in the Vienna negotiations. Some of the people who were crafting the law, like Bernie Vanneroff, who was in the Civilian Secretariat at the time, he was unrepresentative in Vienna when the Firearms Protocol was being negotiated. And then in 2001, it's more a political agreement. You have the UN Programme of Action to combat and prevent illicit trafficking of guns. What do we have in 2022? multiple shootings happening in Khayelitsha over the last couple of years. Just again yesterday, 4 people shot and killed in a shop. So we're seeing in South Africa, so we have 23 people shot and killed every day, so we kind of have a massacre. But I think it's incorrect to call it that, because massacres have particular shape to them. They require fully automatic weapons. We having multiple shootings, that's a new phenomenon, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years, because in the hotel it takes a particular form of political assassinations. And then, of course, we have the global stuff, the Texas massacre, the Buffalo massacre. But so does it mean, things have got worse? Now, when I come to the impact of the law, we'll go there. But what's happening globally is that ammunition, there's this big movement to call weapons and ammunition management, which is something we are not very good at in South Africa. There's massive leakage along that whole kind of firearms control management chain. But that's the big thing happening globally, is weapons and ammunition management stuff. So then the second point I want to make, as I can see my time is going, is the issue of the principles and the key elements. So the key elements are really 3, and this is the Zimmering principles. And it's really about recognizing the state has the authority to determine who has a license to possess. It's a privilege. Our Concord judgment in 2018 says that in South Africa, there's no right to gun possession. It's a privilege under the law. So that's kind of clear. It's been established, reinforced by the Supreme Court of Appeal as well. But most good national gun laws across the world adhere to these principles, as does our Principal Act, the Firearms Control Act. And there really are 3 elements. One is you regulate the person. Okay. And that says who can apply to possess a weapon, who is fit and proper to. You regulate the type of gun and the ammunition, and then you regulate the circumstances. And I'm going to touch on all of them because these are central elements in the current amendment bill. So regulating the person, essentially what that means is you create criteria. So for example, in South Africa, under the Firearms Control Act, we went from 16 to 21. Okay, for the first time put in place issues around domestic violence and the history of violent behavior. Okay, so these are central elements in our current law. The regulating the type of gun. Under the apartheid legislation, essentially there was no limit. The Firearms Control Act brings in significant limits on the type of gun you can own and the number of guns you can own. And then regulate the circumstances. Remember, we are a government of national unity at that time, but it's the same 4 that are across most countries. The circumstances are hunting, sport shooting, private collecting, and self-defense. Noting that self-defense in 62% of countries is not seen as a legitimate reason for possession. Okay, but at the time, it seemed like a reasonable, and it was part of the compromise. One of the compromises, if we go back to regulate type of weapon, is that no limits were put on hunting and sport shooting. That was a political compromise because of the government of national unity. And of course, what happened is that those with enthusiasm and a bit of a habit for gun collecting used that as a loophole to feed their habit and to accumulate guns. So to come back to now, what's happening is we're definitely raising the bar for those who qualify for possession. There are much more stringent provisions around domestic violence and abuse, much more authority given to SAPS to act. So you're seeing the principle, and it's being strengthened in the current bill. Regulating the type of gun, putting limits on dedicated hunters and sport shooters. And also ammunition. Gunfree's view is that there's not enough attention being paid to ammunition and in fact to the types of guns. So there's we would argue that there's further room for strengthening. And then finally, in the regulating the circumstances, you know that the kind of noise about this bill is that section 13 and 14, which allows for the possession of handguns for self-defense, that's been repealed. Okay, I want to argue that although the policy in 2000 enables the possession of handguns for self-defense, the context has changed. And so if you look only at principle, that it's appropriate and it's remaining within the policy and within the principle of regulating the circumstances, that at this moment, it feels that the most appropriate way is to, in fact, repeal that section. Finally, because I know I'm right at the end, is some of my observations on how the current bill is being crafted by officials in the department, within the civilian secretariat. And there are really three observations I want to make. The one is a kind of a skepticism in the kind of most generous terms, in the more worse terms, a disregard for data. Okay, we are sitting with masses of data. It would appear that this data is not really being drawn up to help inform the law, the amendment. In some ways, that's concerning, but it's not surprising. If you think of COVID, think of how many of us didn't believe the science. We didn't want to believe the science. We wanted to sit in our libertarian individual kind of rights notion. We weren't thinking about what was important for the whole of society. Okay, so it's not surprising, but it's concerning because we are in a context where somehow science doesn't matter, facts don't matter. The second thing, and this is a difficult one, but I'm going to raise it, is gun possession, gun control. It's an emotive issue in this country in particular. There are very strong voices that are a minority, but they appear them to be a majority. But what comes into them, the officials, drafting the law, is this notion of balance. They have to balance which I don't like the term pro-gun and anti-gun. It's about gun control and saving lives. And it's about making money out of firearms industry. But for purposes of ease, it's just this notion that one must balance the pro-gun and the anti-gun lobbies in crafting your legislation. That's a concern. Because as policymakers, we need to be looking at what is the impact? Who's going to be most affected by this piece of legislation? And we know it's young men living in urban areas who are killing each other. 89% of our gun homicides are young men. Okay, so what is the legislation doing to reduce the risk for these young men? And what is it for the whole of society? If we look, you saw the piece in the Sunday Times by the trauma surgeons. But the reality is we know that policy and crafting law is this intersection between science and between political compromise. We saw that in COVID. Okay, so there will be political compromise. There was under the 2000. But what does that mean for now? So I'm raising that as a question, because I think this notion of balancing is not helpful. But I recognize at the same time there's compromise. I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much. Some interesting questions that I'm sure we're going to all dive into later. But we're going to hand over next to Eldred de Klerk, who's a policing expert and a director of the African Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis. That's a mouthful if ever I've heard it, which works on security and intelligence as a democratic and transformative praxis, and a comparative policing and social conflict specialist. Eldred has worked as a police training manager at the Center for Conflict Resolution and has trained police members locally and internationally. Eldred has also been the program manager of the policing program at the Graduate School of Public Development Management at the University of Wits. More recently, Eldred has been a member of the panel of experts into public order policing in South Africa after the Farnham Commission of Inquiry. Thank you, Eldred, for being here with us, and over to you for your 20 minutes-ish.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Adele. And Adele was also a member of the panel. So if you want to call me after that, please. And the panel had actually spoken on a number of issues that affects the issue of guns, including the notion of self-defense and property, and what gets defended and what can be reasonably we can expect in regard to legislation regarding that. I'm going to try to build on what Adele has said, and I'm going to look at this from a social conflict perspective, because there are structural, systemic, cultural, and political and socioeconomic issues that affect this whole debate. And somebody who's like Irvin and others who's been involved in this, versed in the idea of social conflict, Adele has raised one of the pillars of what we call good process, and well, all of it. One is the substance of the debate, and what informs this, and the tension between our gut felt notions of what we understand the situation and the context to be, and what the data and the data sets and the scientific analysis said. And often we fail on the analysis because we don't necessarily have all the information uppermost in our mind or at hand. And Adele has alluded and very clearly articulated how fragmented our information sets are, and that they don't necessarily come together in the same point. So there's the substance of the debate, and we need to continue to have that really big discussion around that. And then there's the affective side, and that this is emotional. It's a global thing. And I'm going to make a number of assertions. And one of the assertions I'm going to make is that in the 2015 Firearms Summit, I had left that summit with a clear understanding that one of the agreements we had, that when government seeks to regulate who has a firearm, what type of firearm, with what kind of ammunition, under what circumstances, that is not necessarily an attempt to disarm civilians or South African citizens. I had thought that we had agreed on that with all the necessary lobby groups. And as the person who principally facilitated that, that is actually part of our record, that this was not an attempt by government to disarm. It's a responsibility of government to regulate and to put in place the necessary legislative framework to govern all of the things that Adele had articulated so very clearly. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So there is this effective part of any debate. There's the substantive part of the debate and the evidence and the data and what that says. And all of us have contested facts. And then we do have an emotional investment in it. And then the third part of it is what Adele has already alluded to, is the procedural side. How do we get, as a participative democracy, how do we get the dissenting voices in the disparate communities to actually have an informed conversation? And I think as part of the drafting of this bill, we probably failed ourselves in not having enough of a conversation across the disparate communities and across the various interest groups. Because each of those interest groups has a vested interest in having their voices heard. As somebody who works in the idea of conflict and social conflict, I'm also very deeply concerned about this notion that everything should be balanced and that we should have a compromise. In fact, as a scholar of the field, we don't believe in compromise, because you cannot compromise around somebody feeling safe. You cannot necessarily compromise around the whole of society idea of what it means to be a functional democracy where you address issues of equality, indignity, and endemic poverty. The notion of compromise comes from labor negotiations, where you can have a derivative point. You can say that you're compromising to the nth degree. So in other words, you can split a number infinitely. But you cannot compromise on my need to feel safe. But you can say I will give you 2.765% of whatever. That's where the notion of compromise comes from. And we must be very careful as scholars in the field and as practitioners not to introduce notions of compromise into discussions around interest, and not relegated to where it's most fitting, around percentages and decimal points and the like, because there you can go to split decimal points. So let me go back to these assertions that we had, and I thought we had broadly agreed to. One is the fact that Parliament has a duty to regulate who has access and permissions for a firearm. The owner, the person. Dal has asserted that. I contest that we would all support the notion as South Africans and as fellow citizens that we have that responsibility. I would also assert that we need to define the competencies and the proficiencies that is needed to handle a particular firearm. That you can't just willy-nilly get it and not be proficient, competent, whether it's in terms of the law or the circumstances under which such deadly force can be used. And I would agree, I would contest that we would all agree to that. I would also hold that, and this was broad agreement from the Firearms Summit, that what type of firearm with what kind of ammunition was something that we'd all agree with. And I'm saying this because I want to take that off the table. Yeah, I want to take these assertions off the table, because then it gets into the nitty-gritty around regulation and what in fact the policy environment adds to this once we've all broadly agreed to this. So license provisions is something that government through Parliament needs to regulate. There's also broad agreement that firearms should be stored, carried, and held securely without those who are most vulnerable getting access to it, and that those conditions ought to be regulated. And I think we would all broadly agree that that is necessary. It's also interesting that one of the things we left with from 2015 was a broad agreement that not everybody qualifies to have a firearms license. In fact, all constituent groups across gun owners, hunters, collectors, and others almost broadly agreed that not everybody is necessarily deemed fit and proper. And Adele alluded to those with who may be guilty of violence. We had an age provision to that. So there are other qualifying and disqualifying criteria. So if that is so, if these agreements already exist, then what is the contestation about? And part of the contestation this time around is this idea of self-defense. And I am going to look at that in a second. And the other one I would contend is the idea of process, and that we did not necessarily take the time. We were supposed to have had a firearm summit last year. In fact, we would have had two components of the firearm summit since 2015. And for whatever reason, be it Omicron, COVID, or just a lack of political will, we didn't have the firearm summits. We needed to have constituency consultations with broad-based interest groups to consider where they were at further to the firearm summit, so that we can better prepare and listen and understand what folks' interests are and what our shared interests are as South Africans. Which leads me to the other point that we had also concluded the 2015 Firearm Summit with. And that is the broader question of what kind of society do we want to build in South Africa, and what role does firearms play in that society? The assumption is that firearms will always be with us and that we need it to defend ourselves. That is the prevailing assumption. And that assumption is further problematic insofar as that it necessarily says that all of us necessarily agree that there's a role for firearms in a democratic society. And what role or how does this vision of an armed citizenry dovetail with our constitutional responsibility to build an equitable, just, violence-free South Africa, where the dignity of all is actually upheld. So do we just assume that firearms will get us there, that that's the role that firearms play? I don't know. I think we ought to be addressing that, and we ought to be addressing it from families to streets to disparate communities to a much more broader facilitated conversation as South Africans to understand what in fact is the constitutional promise, what is the constitutional need, and how does firearms factor into that. So there is an imperative to address the socioeconomic frailties of our country. There is an imperative to further the developmental agenda as outlined in the NDP 2030. In none of that, I personally see a role for firearms. I simply don't. And whether it's an armed militia, namely the police, or the state's ability to, or not ability, but the state's purview to have authorized force under particular circumstances, all of that should be up for debate. Because we've moved on from arming an 18-year-old with a gun in the club and uniform and an authorization to use force on our behalf. And then we abdicate responsibility for that. We moved on from that. We now understand that anybody with a gun, whether it's a state actor or private individual, that those circumstances need to be regulated. So in the final analysis, one of the things that confront me when I look at this from a procedural point of view is this idea that we better have this debate, that now is the time for the Civilian Secretariat and the Department of Police and Parliament as such to actually have the constituency debate, to re-engage around not necessarily the fundamental tenets that informs the legislation, to look at both its impact and to look at what is needed to regulate said legislation. Because I think in broad terms, we can agree what a piece of legislation needs to do and what it attempts to do. I don't think there's broad-based disagreement around that. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think we can agree on that. Where we tend to fall short, and maybe where we tend to differ, is the issue of how do we put that into practice? What does it look like when it comes to regulation? And part of the biggest regulation, like I said, is this issue of the circumstances, the compelling reasons for me to acquire a firearm. Self-defense has become this catch-all term that seems to just suggest that I can simply put on a piece of paper that in some way I need it for self-defense. Well, as a scholar of the subject, maybe I think we need to unpack that. What exactly does it mean? Because together with self-defense is this idea of vulnerability, is this idea of risk. And this is not an academic exercise. So when the legislation says give compelling reasons, is it enough for me to simply put down self-defense? Or should I spell out the reasons under which I feel that either myself, my family is under some compelling will or could be under some compelling threat. And under that threat, I need some aid, namely a firearm, to protect myself and that which I own and those who I love, because in those circumstances, I am vulnerable. And I'm not necessarily the arbiter of understanding how different people are vulnerable. Yet, can we say to a state entity who has our best interest at heart to say, look, you can't ask that question. That you can't ask of me to give compelling reasons as to why I should have a deadly weapon in my hand. I think the state would be remiss to not ask you for those compelling reasons and establish some sort of framework under which it's clear how that those compelling circumstances are debated, and then how a decision is made based on whatever argument I make. And that I may have recourse then to, if I'm refused, to having that reviewed in some form, shape, or another. So we cannot simply rest at the idea that the panacea of a notion like self-defense cannot and should not necessarily be unpacked, and that the individual circumstances should not necessarily be interrogated and reviewed before I am given a firearm. So I'm putting that on the table, and I'm hoping that we can have that debate going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. He said he would take 15 minutes, and he was exactly right, even to the second. Thank you both. Some very interesting questions for us all to grapple with. I'm going to start by opening the floor here in the room. I don't know if anybody wants to put their hand up in the old school way of hands up. People who are online, if you could, new school way of putting your hands up there, and Irvin is going to help me manage those. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Esther. I'm from the APA, Organized Crime Component. I've just got a few contributions to make to the debate.
Alistair, can I ask you to project your voice so that the mics can hear for those online?
I just have a few contributions, just comments basically, to make in relation to the debate. The first is in relation to the scientific or statistical lack of, let's say, understanding in relation to what the stats are in relation to firearms. Now, the two components is the illegal and there's the legal. And you mentioned that you need to regulate the legal in order to assist in regulating the illegal. That's an interesting point. But then also one needs to take into consideration, especially in relation to illegal use. You will have the situation that normally skews, I think it skews statistics. You will have situations where, for instance, illegal firearms have been flooded. You know, they've basically flooded the gang-infested communities. Where they get the firearm, we don't know. Where they get the ammunition in particular, we don't know. But I'm sure that it has affected obviously it has affected the rate of deaths, the amount of deaths. But just as a comment from my personal observation, you know, within the criminal society, we've got different types of criminals. So you get your criminal who's a thief, and then you get your criminal who's a murderer or an assassin, and then you get your criminals more leaning towards white collar type crime. One is going to business. So the murderer had like 30 to 40 murders under his job. Because he's the assassin, that's his job, you know. But the guy who basically just breaks into your house, he's never touched a firearm. In fact, refuses to touch a firearm. He refuses to draw blood. That is why there's the distinction. And also the murderers are normally imported from a different province to perform the murder, and then, you know, they then return. So that's the one comment in relation to that. And then the other, well, in relation to the view, well, I'm not sure if it's the official view of the NPA, but I might be speaking out of turn.
What you believe is the view of the NPA, right?
Let me say it's my personal view. Okay. From my personal experience, having worked in the communities, etc. There's a difference between an individual who's violent, who has a propensity towards violence, and an ordinary individual. And often we find that, in my view, not the NPA's view, in my view, that if there's proper education and socialization early on in respect of the child, then we often won't have the propensity towards violence or solving disputes violently at a later stage. But if there's no system or social intervention at an early stage, then you often will find that by the time the person is 14, starts committing murders and will be dead by 26, 24, 20, whatever, you know. So that is the other thing. And the last comment I wanted to make was the whole idea of government use or government force in relation to firearms and how one regulates that. I think we also need to take into consideration, not only from the policing perspective, but also from this is now in relation to weapons. It's also from let's call it arm, because we can see if you've got a tree-happy president, you're often going to have a much more violent society and propensity or potential towards. And what then happens to a vulnerable state, which is not armed, which then gets attacked, as we see. And how long will they be able to withstand that sort of force without themselves being armed? So that then might inform the debate of defense, self-defense.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that question, those set of comments, or shall we take, I know Gwen de Reemarker has a question in the online space. Do you want to take Gwen's question? Gwen, can you hear us? I don't know if we're muted here. Let me just
Very
check.
well. Can you hear me?
Perfect, Gwen. Hi.
Hi, Kenny.
Nice to hear you, if not to see you. Go ahead.
Wait, let me put my camera on and hope that this works. There we go. Thanks to all the presenters for the great input, and Eldred specifically for almost putting focusing on emotions and almost the philosophical aspects that we're dealing with in this issue. And I had two comments / questions that maybe both presenters could engage with. And the first one is Eldred's point about that need to have a debate. And at the same time, the need not to, or the danger to seek consensus or balance or something like that, which is fundamentally misaligned with a public health approach. And I think a public health approach is very much needed. And I saw Richard Matsopoulos was in the room, so I'm obviously speaking very much under correction from him here. But so my question was, how, if we have that debate, how do we ensure that all voices are heard? We know recently that gun owners have flooded parliaments with comments on the bill. How do we make sure that voices of the families who've lost family members to gun violence are also heard? And is there not a role from civil society to also bring to force those voices in the debate almost? Because I think that would bring us that balance almost in terms of the impact that firearm violence has on communities, on too many communities. And then for what purpose? Is it to entrench the position that we need to reduce civilian access to firearms, or would that debate serve another purpose? That's kind of the question I was grappling with hearing Eldred's input. And then my second reflection is, I think there is a big elephant in the room, which is the lack of enforcement and police corruption in terms of firearm management. And that this bill seeks to strengthen a system that's fundamentally broken. And so I think we've got to, so because there is no trust in that system, there is naturally going to be enormous resistance to the bill, and the bill is exceptional. But how do we deal with that lack of enforcement, and how do we deal with police corruption in terms of firearms? It wasn't just the Prince slogans. We know that police firearms or firearms that land in the police system, whereas an SAP 13 or other channels, how do we make sure that those are or that enforcement is strengthened and police corruption is stopped? Because if there is more trust in the system, then I think people will be more open to, or gun owners will be more open to amendments such as the ones that are currently under consideration. And even because the removal of Section 13 on self-defense, if there are so many guns in the illicit world, I mean, not a single sound-minded gun owner will support anything that removes gun ownership for self-defense. And so I don't know, it's just something that I think we also need to address. It's those two aspects. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Gwen Berrymaker, Department of the Premier, Western Cape Government. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Gwen. Some big questions there. Do you want to take a stab? Who would like to go first?
I mean, I'm happy, I mean, because I think the question that comes across both Gwen and Alistair is the kind of relationship between legal and illegal. And what's really critical to understand around the control of firearms is, unlike drugs, they are a legitimate trade. They are massive treaties between governments which allow for the manufacture, trade, transfer, sale of weapons. It's legitimate. All guns, 99.9%, start their life off as a legal entity. It's a legal commodity, which is why you have to regulate them. Once the weapon leaves the legal market, nowhere in the world can you regulate it. It's gone. It's out the system. It's in the illicit market. The only way we use the notion of a swimming pool and a tap. So at the moment, there's a swimming pool and it's teeming with weapons, mainly illegal. It's clear that most crimes are committed with illegal guns. But they were once legal. They were absolutely once legal. Where did they come from? Three big sources. In South Africa, on average, 24 guns are lost or stolen by civilians every single day. 24 legal guns are moving into the illegal market. Cops, 2 to 3 guns. Your biggest source of weapons is civilians, number one. The second source is definitely fraud and corruption, all along the firearms control management chain. From when you hand in your weapon at the SAPS 13 store, sometimes goes out the back door. And then the third is cross-border trade. Now, there is some, but you know, we kind of get a bit stuck. You'll hear a lot of people say, oh, it's the caches from the Liberation Army. Why would you want to go and dig up a weapon that's 40 years old when you can get a handgun in 5 seconds on the street corner? You know, I mean, so I think again, it's looking, what does the data tell us about where these weapons are coming from? So you have to mop up, you have to recover the illegal, but you have to turn off the tap. So you have to do both. You cannot control weapons without recovering the illegal and controlling the legal. You have to do both. They really talk to each other. I think the other is, so we know that lack of enforcement, corruption and fraud is one of the big sources of weapons moving from the legal into the illegal. I think the other thing that, I guess just, Alistair, the issue of early intervention is critical. And there's a lot of work that's been done with the Violence Prevention Forum, which is a kind of multi-sectorial, alliance and network of organizations, including government, the NPA, I think is their treasury. But it's that you have to intervene early on. However, if you again look at what the evidence shows you, is if you look at our criteria for licensed possession, it's got there in the amendment an element of violence, that if you have an element of violence as a potential applicant, that you are automatically excluded. You can't even actually go into the next step. We've argued that we need to define that But the reason, much more carefully, but the reason it's important is that all the evidence shows that if you have a prior history of violence, you're much more likely to abuse the weapon and either harm yourself or kill someone. That's the single. So people, alcohol obviously abuse, compromises sort of responsibility, et cetera, but that's the single. So people say, well, mental health. There's no evidence that mental health is a key factor in driving gun violence. It's about a prior history of violent behavior, and that's why you need to intervene early on. And I'm going to use last thing is the one thing I forgot to say is across the world, but in South Africa, over a 10-year period when our gun law was being implemented properly, we reduced our gun deaths by 50%, from 34 to 18. Why would you not? And if you know that it was about reducing gun availability, why wouldn't you want to bring a bold bill like this? Imagine if we could reduce our homicide rates by a third because we're taking guns out of circulation. So just to say that strong gun laws make a difference, they make an impact. And if you have, if you are someone who engages in violence, the weapon makes a difference. Having a gun can kill many more people than having a knife. Okay, so again, it's not about whether you like guns or don't like them. It's about their lethality. And that's why you have to control them and restrict access.
Thank you, Adele. Just in quick response to both Gwen and Alistair. You're right, Alistair, that there is a utility to violence and there's a utility to using weapons. And there's a strongly held belief in South Africa, unfortunately, despite our negotiated outcome and the emphasis on negotiation and dialogue, that we can solve things through violence. That's just that. And that there are a few of us in our societies that have an appetite for violence. And you've outlined how violence is used by different people. And we have the belief that guns are necessarily pervasive across all of that. You also spoke to the idea, I think, between yourself and Gwen, to the state's monopoly of violence and the state's monopoly of weapons, and how in that chain there needs to be stronger regulation, stronger assessing of the integrity of those who are tasked with custodianship of the state's monopoly of violence. The interesting part, I don't know if it was you who mentioned this idea of us being vulnerable, or I think it may have been Gwen, through our defense not having weapons, right? Some of us in the room were part of the defense review process way back when we had the very first defense review process. And there was a collective understanding that the only reason South Africa would ever go to war is in defense of ourselves. That we will not be the aggressor, that we wouldn't need the kind of pre-1994 armory capacity and capability to go to war with the region. That was not something that we stood for, and in terms of our higher constitutional values, nor what our aspirations for building a better world. And given our history of violence across the region, that was not something that we saw as being that. So we took away the death penalty, for example. We took away sections of the Criminal Procedure Act that allowed somebody to be shot in the back. And so I can go on. So what I'm asking myself is, at what point did we drop the ball on these higher values that we actually predicated both our constitution on and had a vision for the kind of society that we're building going forward? And then don't we as OGs have a responsibility to ensure that for the kids that are coming, we always have to be building for the future. Do we want to leave them the gun caches as part of their legacy and heresy? Not heresy, their legacy and heritage, because it is a heresy, the fact that it's there. So let me move on from that. And Gwen is right in terms of saying, who frames the debate? Who seems to have the motivation, the resources, and the interest to continue to frame the debate? And the debate now is narrowly framed, in spite of all the other provisions around which we agree, around this notion of self-defense. So that's where it is. Anybody who says, I can't defend myself, as anti-democratic, as wrong in a thing, and in fact, you should have violence against them for saying that I can't defend myself, right? So who's framing that debate? And why all this energy and resources being spent on skewing the debate away from the impact of violence more generally and the impact of weapons like guns more specifically? Because that's the debate. And if it is one of health, and if it's one of a whole of society being traumatized or being vulnerable, then let's have that debate. So she's right in saying, how do we introduce other aspects to this and other voices to this debate? And I'm saying going forward, I think there's a responsibility on the Department of Police through the Civilian Secretariat and ourselves to ensure that we create those platforms for engagement and that we deepen and broaden the voices that is brought to bear and the perspectives that is brought to bear when it comes to the piece of legislation that is in front of us. Bearing in mind that we're living with something which is the current act that we all basically agree with, that we seem to have no big contention with. So let's in fact do what we say we're going to do and broaden that debate.
Kelly, if I may, I would like to hear Adele and Eldred, what your views are in terms of this bill going forward, in relation to, is it necessary for us, given the fact that the debate is so fierce, there's so many vested interests in this particular debate, whether in fact we shouldn't encourage the state players, the ministry, the Civilian Secretariat and Parliament and all Parliament to reconvene a second firearm summit that is properly convened. There's proper consultations with the parties, and if we dare compromise, Eldred, the points in terms of this particular bill, if one looks at it, there are areas that our police service cannot manage, and that's the Central Firearms Registry. It's dysfunctional. And isn't it time that maybe there's a moratorium on new applications until the backlog is sorted? Let me just hear what your views are on that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go first. Part of my notes and closing remarks would have been around this thing that we may have to relook, redraft, and review what we have in front of us. Especially, as I say, I try to make an attempt on the broad consensus that we have. If we start there, if we acknowledge and are truthful in terms of the state's capability and capacity to manage, especially the regulation side of this, and what might be needed, then maybe we call pause on the process and that we re-engage. And that we do what we said we're going to do a few years ago, and that's have the other parts of the summit, the firearm summit. We're all gearing up for it. So let's do that. Let's have that. It is a participative democracy after all, and let's strengthen that. And when it comes to the issue of regulation, it just calls a pause on new firearm applications, for example, and let's process the backlog. If there is a backlog, and remember, whenever I ask for something, whether it's for a car license, a firearm license, or for a home loan, I can get one of three answers: yes, no, maybe. And the maybe have all those conditions, and if I don't meet those conditions, I may still get a no. So there's no inherent right because I put in an application that I will get a driver's license, for example. I have to go through the test, I have to do everything, or a home loan, or a firearm license for that matter. So I would just call a pause and re-engage the process.
Adele, over to you.
You're going to have your email flooded and shut down now. Erwin, thank you. It's an interesting question. I mean, in talking to sort of some of our alliance partners, everyone says, this is not a good time for the law. It's because things are a bit fractured. There's never going to be a good time to ban handguns. I mean, I'm going to put it out there. There's never going to be a good time, and so, what are the conditions? We know, having worked in the policy space, that what's happening around you is key to whether a policy gets traction and movement and stuff. And we're very clear that one of the reasons the Firearms Control Bill in 2000 got the kind of traction it did because it was seen as part of the transformative agenda of this country, and we're not in that space. But what I want to say is it's appropriate 20 years down the road to be looking at your gun law and saying what needs to change, because I guess 2 or 3 things. One is, what is the data telling you about the kind of where gun violence is happening, who's using the guns, what kind of guns are people interested in? The other is that there have been big global developments. So I mentioned the Firearms Protocol in 2000. It was then translated into the regional SADC Firearms Protocol, which is in fact stronger than our national gun law. That's just been revised. That was revised and strengthened in August. So we now have to domesticate that. And that's something Gun-Free has put on the table with the Civilian Secretariat, is how is the revised SADC protocol going to impact on this amendment? The other big global developments on this issue. So things are changing, and even nationally, the fact that our Court made this ruling is that gun ownership is a privilege and not a right, under our Constitution. That was implicit in a way in the policy, but it's now been made explicit. So amending a legislation at this point, 20 years down the road, is appropriate. Also, we've discovered there are lots of loopholes in the Act, which were unintentional. We didn't see them. But then when you put it into practice, you begin to see ways in which people use the loopholes to bypass, etc. So I think, it is appropriate always to review your legislation. I think in terms of the bilateral, the Civilian Secretariat's been having bilaterals for the last 6 months with key kind of stakeholders and interest groups. I would think one thing that would possibly help a bilateral is, a firearms summit is drawing on some of Eldred's summary of what happened in 2015, and then looking at the bilaterals over this 6 months and saying, what are the consensus points? What are the things that, because once you put everyone in the room, you actually can't get past first base because everyone's screaming and shouting at each other. And so it's what is the consensus? Put it on the table and then say, what are the sticking points? And so then there's a thing of, and then you agree with the consensus, not in 5 minutes, you can spend a whole morning on it. But then, okay, what are the sticking points and how do we manage that? So I would think that would be a way through. The last thing I want to say is the idea of the Central Firearms Registry. The issue has been raised is whether it should be taken outside of the SAPs. Okay, that idea is floating around. And we're hoping that there's been some research that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks. We've done a little bit of work on it, and of course, there's only one country. I think it's I'm going to get it wrong. I don't think it's Costa Rica. There's one country that has the central database register for firearms completely outside of the state. It's privatized. Most people you talk to working in the small arms control movement globally, it's a bad idea. You have as many problems around management and corruption. But the one idea that it's Thailand has it, I think Japan, a couple of countries where it's not in the police ministry, it's in the interior ministry, it's managed, it remains the responsibility of the estate, but it's taken outside of the police. I think that, anyway, so it's definitely an interesting idea. And I think it's something we need a bit more research on. I think the admin of this act, and my understanding is some of the amendments in the current bill try and address it can be a bit onerous, this law. And so I think that is about how do we make it efficient without cutting corners. Yeah.
So Irvin, I just want to check. I know we have participants in the online space, the NPA and the Civilian Secretariat for Police, some of the drafters of the law, the Premier's Office, the Department of Community Safety, the Human Rights Council, people like Richard Misopoulos and Dirk van Sale-Smith. Are there any, I just want to check if there's any, not to put you all call you out in the true classroom style. Does any one of those people have a question? But just to check that out, there are no questions.
No, I have further questions.
I'm going to abuse the power of the chair for a second and just return to Gwen's question about capacity and trust in the state, which I think is really interesting, and to kind of hook it into the area that I'm interested in, which is my work is in domestic violence. And so to kind of ask you your views on whether you think this law is going to improve what is a really disastrous situation currently around firearms and domestic violence, and the fact that the police are routinely not doing anything around confiscating firearms, and that, you know, we obviously have the problem of police who are offenders as well. And I think that some of that hooks into that idea of a state that is just functionally incapable of regulating themselves or others. If you have any views on that, you want to do.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is some light. And again, this is why the amendment is key. So what the amendment has done is it's raised the barrier for license applicants. In the current act, you have to have a conviction under the DVA without the option of a fine. So that's actually, that's very low bar. You know, I mean, how many people are being convicted? So what they've done now is the two things, is that even if there's an interim order, protection order in place or in play, as an existing gun owner, your gun is immediately removed. As a potential applicant, your application is put on hold. Okay, so they're using a much more of a red flag system. Okay, but there are problems. There are a number of problems. And again, does the state have the capacity to do this? The one is, and I think it's a general problem with the amendment as well as our current law, is it's too much discretion for police officers. So it says may. Most of us know Women's Legal Centre, the MRC, Gun Free. We have all said it has to be must. There must be it must be that the state has the obligation, not just the authority, has the obligation. We think that's a kind of, I mean, we that's what we see as the purpose of engaging in a policy, is to, it's those tiny details that make a difference. The other is, and we're pushing for this, is the DVA register at the local substation. So we know that these kind of, what do we call them? Stereotypes, prejudices. You know, she came and she laid a charge and then she withdrew. She withdrew for a reason. She's being threatened. She's scared. It's not that she's not serious. And so if there's even a charge that was withdrawn, you look at it. And if this guy's applying for a gun license, you check the DVA register. That's a lot of work. Okay, that's a lot of admin. Can we do that? So I think for those of us working this, it's about exploring what's going to be the most efficient and what's going to have the desired impact. Now we also know, and this is the difficult one, and I don't know if someone like Naima is online, is that we know that when a final protection order is issued, it significantly increases your risk of lethality as a woman. And then there's a gun in the home, which is why the gun must be removed. I mean, personally, gun-free, we've had a lot of success with that. Is we have women phoning us saying, I'm being abused by my husband, I've got a protection order. We phone the local station, and they responded in a couple of hours. They have the authority, even under the current act, to remove. I think the other thing clearly is this thing of education. We've got a slogan called, know the law, use the law, save a life. We can save one woman's life. If you have a neighbor that you know has a gun in the home and is abusing his wife or girlfriend, you don't have to lay a charge, you just do a report. And generally cops can be quite responsive. But I think it's that, and this is where we would need, so, gun-free works around the gun control space. We look at who's being affected by gun violence. But this is where the violence against women sector becomes absolutely critical. They need to engage, and they have engaged very intensely with the Civilian Secretariat of what's going to work What is the evidence tells us, and we know the presence of a weapon alters the outcome. And women, many women who end up being seriously injured or even killed, their friends will say, he spent 20 years abusing her with the weapon, not holding it to her head, just looking at the safe where it was held. So she knew that he was saying, I have a gun in there and I can deal with this if you. So I think it's really understanding how can the law, and we know that the law is about enforcement, but it's about compliance, and it's a broader context of how people think about violence and how we think about our responsibility within our communities to report. We're too scared to report because someone else, it's that. So it's a kind of whole issue, but for me, the purpose of lawmaking is that you need to look at what's going to have the most direct impact in the quickest possible time, and that's the law that's also is implementable. So I think I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and the latest NRC data is showing that there's an increase of women being killed in non-intimate partner violence and not in the home with guns. What is that? What is that telling us? What is that telling us?
There's a question in the online space from Amanda Dissel. Amanda, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your presentations. I'm from the Department of Community Safety. I feel compelled to respond once we've been named earlier. Thank you very much. I think everybody's raised this issue, and Gwen spoke to it earlier about this need to concentrate on law enforcement, and particularly enforcement of our existing legislation and procedures around gun control. We have a plethora of them already, as you have already said, but what we need to make sure is that these are actually being implemented and carried through. So I think there's a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done in the criminal justice sector to promote these and to make sure that a firearm harms reduction approach takes precedence and priority. In the Western Cape government, we are working on a firearm harms reduction strategy with the key role players, and that's our key focus of intervention is trying to improve our oversight and tracking of firearms related cases. The NPA can talk about a lot of the work that they are doing in this regard, just to make sure that all firearms cases are properly tracked, properly investigated, brought before court. And then also, as Adele said, all those procedures that are available in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, that those are actually being implemented by the courts. So there's a number of areas that we need to look at. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Are there any other questions in the room? Any last thoughts from Eldred or Adele?
Just to say thank you to Adele and to those who contributed. And Adele raised the issue of compliance, because this is often where a lot of our so-called world-class legislation falls flat, is that there's non-compliance. And we don't have the capability within the state often, because we've removed inspectors, compliance officers, we've removed people with a dedicated function to look at very specific things, and we're not necessarily harnessing appropriate technology to support the functioning of state departments. And this within the broader framework of this counter-systemic threat to undermining the capability and efficiency of state departments. That notwithstanding, there's a lot that we have failed to do when it comes to ensuring that we have effective and efficient state departments that are well capacitated with the core competencies and the necessary infrastructure and capability to fulfill its role to regulate legislation. So it's on the compliance side that we're often falling flat.
I guess the one thing is to say that we saw this in 2000, and we can see it again. It's picking up on what Amanda said, is that revising a law
lawmaking can seem as kind of like this dry policy kind of environment. Not, it's exciting. The lawmaking process is an opportunity to shift people's attitudes and thinking about guns. And I'm clear about that. It's this debate is up here. There's an opportunity to insert into the debate, to expose myths, to have conversations. And so, you know, this is not a kind of dry, dead period, but it's a period for really surfacing all of the stuff so that we can actually get the best possible amendment that comes to our parliament. Most likely not this year, but definitely next year, and definitely before the 2024 election. Yeah.
Well, thank you to you both from the Centre of Criminology. This has been so interesting, and we hope we can count on inviting you back at some other time. And thank you also to all of the participants in the audiences, both here in person and virtually. It's been lovely to spend the last hour and a half with you. And please look out for our next seminar announcement, which should come out in the next couple of weeks. We have a busy program over the next couple of months. And we look forward to welcoming many of you back again. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Can we talk? I mean, actually,
Can we gossip?